Victor had lived on his farmland for over 15 years, tending to his crops and livestock with the kind of dedication only a true farmer possessed. His land was his pride, a sprawling stretch of fields, dotted with patches of trees and bordered by a sturdy wooden fence that had stood the test of time. The property had been passed down in his family for generations, and he took great care in maintaining it. It wasn't just a place of work for him. It was home, a piece of his history, and something he intended to protect. For years, he had little trouble from the outside world. The town was quiet, the neighbors friendly, and aside from the occasional deer straying too close to his crops, Victor rarely had to deal with intruders. That all changed when Karen moved in. Karen wasn't like the other neighbors. She was loud, entitled, and had a habit of treating everything around her as if it belonged to her. She had moved into a property on the opposite side of the dirt road leading to Victor's farm, purchasing a large house with a perfectly manicured lawn and an expensive driveway that led up to a garage big enough to fit 3 cars. At first, Victor had no reason to interact with her. He preferred to mind his own business, and he expected others to do the same. Then, one morning, he saw for the first time the deep, freshly made tire tracks slicing through the soft soil of his field. They ran from one end of the property to the other, cutting directly through his crops, disturbing the young shoots he had carefully planted just weeks before. Victor frowned, crouching down to inspect the damage. The tracks were wide and deep, ATV tires without a doubt. Whoever had driven through had done so recklessly, with no regard for the land they were destroying. Victor had an uneasy feeling as he stood back up and scanned the property. He hadn't heard anything during the night, and his security cameras weren't set up in this particular part of the field. He sighed, brushing his hand through his beard. Maybe it had been kids joyriding through the open space, not realizing they were damaging private property. He figured it would be a one-time thing. But then it happened again and again. Within a week, Victor had started noticing a pattern. The tire tracks appeared almost daily, crisscrossing his fields and leaving trails of flattened crops behind. He found torn pieces of grass stuck in the dirt, broken stalks where something, or rather, someone, had driven through without a care in the world. It didn't take long before he caught sight of the culprit. One afternoon, while checking on his livestock, Victor heard the distant hum of an engine. It was faint at first, barely noticeable against the gentle rustling of the wind through the trees, but it grew louder by the second. Then, through the far edge of his property, he saw her. Karen. She was riding an ATV, speeding through his fields as if she owned them. The large tires chewed through the soft earth, kicking up dirt and debris in their wake. She didn't even slow down as she passed through his crops, tearing a straight line through the land he had worked so hard to cultivate. Victor watched in disbelief as she laughed, gripping the handlebars tightly while leaning into a turn. Her blonde hair, tied in a tight ponytail, bounced behind her, and she was wearing expensive sunglasses, the kind someone might wear for a day at the beach rather than an ATV ride through someone else's farmland. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. She wasn't lost. She wasn't confused about where she was. No, Karen knew exactly what she was doing. Furious, Victor waved his arms, trying to get her attention. "Hey," he shouted, his voice carrying over the open fields. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" But she didn't stop. If anything, she went faster. She sped past him, the roar of the ATV drowning out any other noise. As she passed, she barely spared him a glance, offering nothing more than an amused smirk before disappearing over the small hill that led to the back end of his property. Victor clenched his fists. This wasn't just some random accident or a one-time mistake. She was doing this on purpose. That evening, Victor sat on his porch, his eyes fixed on the fields. He wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when it came to his land. It wasn't just about the damage, though that was bad enough. It was about the sheer disrespect of it all. Karen wasn't just cutting across his property. She was doing it without a single ounce of remorse, as if she had the right to be there, as if the rules didn't apply to her, as if the rules didn't apply to her. So, the next day, he took action. Victor spent the morning hammering in bright red signs around the edges of his property. No trespassing. Private property. And 2 years later, Victor understood why he had painted the words so boldly. They were printed in capital letters, large enough to be read from a distance. He even went a step further, reinforcing the weaker parts of his fence with stronger wooden posts, making it clear that his land was not for her to use as an off-road playground. He figured that would be enough to send a message. But Karen didn't care. That afternoon, the sound of an ATV rumbled through the air once more, and Victor rushed outside, just in time to see her plowing straight through his crops again. Only this time, something was different. As soon as she spotted him standing by the fence, she suddenly slammed on the brakes, her ATV skidding slightly as she came to a stop. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then, to his shock, she started yelling. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen screeched, her voice filled with anger. Victor's jaw nearly dropped. Was she seriously yelling at him? "You're on my property," he shot back, stepping forward. "What the hell are you doing, driving through my land every day?" Karen scoffed, flipping her sunglasses up onto her head. "Your land? Oh, please. I've lived here for 6 months, and everyone knows this is just an open field. I have a right to ride through it if I want to." Victor took another step forward, his patience wearing thin. "No, you don't. This is private property. My property. You're trespassing." Karen crossed her arms, tilting her head. "Oh, so you own the dirt now? You can't just claim open land and expect people not to use it." Victor pointed at the signs. "Do those look like decorations to you? Get off my land before I call the sheriff." At the mention of the authorities, Karen's expression darkened. She revved the ATV's engine, glaring at him through narrowed eyes. "Go ahead," she said. "Call whoever you want. I'm not doing anything wrong." Then, without another word, she turned sharply and sped off, the ATV kicking up dust as she disappeared over the ridge once more. Victor stood there for a long time, his fists clenched at his sides. He had tried to be reasonable. He had put up the signs, reinforced the fence, even spoken to her directly. But Karen had made one thing clear. She wasn't going to stop. So if she wanted to play this game, Victor would make sure she lost. Victor didn't waste time. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, he was already outside, walking the perimeter of his property, checking the signs he had put up the day before. Most of them were still standing, though a few had been knocked over, whether by the wind or something else. He couldn't say for sure. His gut told him Karen had something to do with it. He picked up one of the fallen signs, dusted it off, and drove it back into the ground. The sooner she understood that he wasn't going to let her run wild over his land, the better. Then, right on cue, the distant hum of an engine broke the early morning stillness. Victor turned toward the sound, his jaw tightening. Here we go again. Karen's ATV crested the ridge at full speed, cutting across the same section of land she had ruined yesterday. She didn't slow down. If anything, she was going faster. Her blonde ponytail whipped behind her as she leaned into a turn, one hand gripping the throttle, the other casually resting on her hip. Victor had had enough. Without hesitation, he strode toward his truck, yanked open the door, and climbed inside. The engine roared to life, and he threw it into gear. If she wanted to play games, fine. He'd play. He accelerated across the uneven terrain, bouncing slightly as he hit the dirt path that ran parallel to where she was riding. Karen, oblivious at first, kept speeding along, kicking up dirt and tearing through his crops. But the moment she glanced to her left and saw Victor's truck gaining on her, her entire posture changed. She yanked the handlebar sharply, veering away from him as if she could outrun a vehicle designed for off-road driving. Victor wasn't interested in some high-speed chase. He just wanted her to stop. He honked the horn, short, sharp bursts that echoed over the open fields. She ignored it. He pressed harder on the gas, pulling ahead and angling the truck so she couldn't just cut across his land unchallenged. Karen must have realized she was running out of space because she suddenly slammed on the brakes. The ATV skidded to a stop, sending up a cloud of dust. Victor braked hard, his truck stopping just a few feet away from where she sat on the ATV, her expression a mixture of defiance and irritation. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Karen, in true Karen fashion, ripped off her sunglasses and pointed an accusing finger at him. What the hell do you think you're doing? She yelled, as if he were the one tearing up her property. Victor gritted his teeth. He wasn't a man who lost his temper easily, but the sheer audacity of this woman was starting to push his limits. I should be asking you that, he shot back, stepping out of the truck and slamming the door behind him. I told you yesterday, this is private property. My land. You don't belong here. Karen scoffed, shifting on her ATV like she was settling in for a long argument. Oh, give me a break, she said, rolling her eyes. It's just a field. It's not like I'm hurting anything. Victor took a deliberate step forward. You're destroying my crops. Karen waved a dismissive hand. Oh, come on. It's just grass. It's not grass, he snapped. It's food. It's my livelihood. And even if it was just grass, that doesn't give you the right to drive through it like it's your personal racetrack. Karen tilted her head, a smug smile playing at her lips. Well, maybe if you put up a real fence, I wouldn't have to use this route. Victor's fingers curled into fists. You don't have to use this route. You have an entire road in front of your house. There's no reason for you to be cutting across my property. Karen pursed her lips, pretending to think. Well, yeah, but the road is boring. And besides, this is a shortcut. Victor exhaled sharply through his nose. A shortcut to where? The main road is less than 100 feet from your driveway. You're not saving time. Karen smirked, flipping her sunglasses back down over her eyes. Well, I like riding here, and there's nothing you can do about it. Victor took another step forward. You sure about that? Something in his tone must have unsettled her, because for the first time, Karen's smirk faltered. She hesitated, gripping the ATV handlebars a little tighter. You wouldn't dare, she said, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. Victor held her gaze. Try me. For a few long seconds, they stared each other down. Then, without another word, Karen revved the engine, spun the ATV around, and took off in the opposite direction, back toward her house. Victor watched her go, his fists still clenched at his sides. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Victor didn't waste time. After Karen sped off, he knew her type, entitled, arrogant, and convinced she could get away with whatever she wanted just by throwing a tantrum. He had seen it before in town. The way she treated clerks at the grocery store or how she talked down to people who worked on her car. Karen didn't respect boundaries, and a polite conversation sure as hell wasn't going to change that. So Victor did the only thing left in his power. He made it physically impossible for her to continue trespassing. That afternoon, he got to work. He reinforced the fence along the back of his property with stronger wooden posts and even added a few thick steel cables between them, just low enough that an ATV wouldn't be able to plow through. He dug up trenches along the main path she had been using, filling them with loose dirt that would swallow up her tires if she tried again. And just for good measure, he installed a few trail cameras, their lenses hidden within the tree line, ready to capture any proof he might need if she ignored his warnings. It wasn't a question of if Karen would try again. It was a question of when. And sure enough, it didn't take long. The next evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Victor was sitting on his porch with a cold beer in his hand when he heard the familiar growl of Karen's ATV. He didn't rush to stop her this time. He just sat back and watched. It came in fast, clearly expecting to blast through his land like she always had. But then she hit the first trench. Victor smirked as her front tires dipped into the loose dirt, yanking her forward with a sudden jolt. The ATV wobbled violently as Karen struggled to regain control, her arms flailing. She slammed on the brakes just in time to avoid going completely nose first into the ground, but the machine jerked to one side, throwing her off balance. She landed hard, kicking up dust as she hit the dirt. Victor stood up, taking a slow sip of his beer as he walked toward the fence where Karen was sprawled out, groaning. Looks like you hit a rough patch, he called out. Karen shot up instantly, brushing the dirt off her expensive designer leggings. What the hell did you do? She shrieked, kicking at the loose soil, as if it had personally offended her. Victor leaned against the fence post, his face calm. Fixed a problem. Karen's eyes darted around, scanning the reinforced fence, the trenches, the warning signs that were still standing. She was fuming. This is insane, she shouted. You can't do this. Victor raised an eyebrow. I can't put up barriers on my own land. Karen clenched her fists. You're ruining my ride. Victor couldn't help but chuckle. That's the point, sweetheart. Her nostrils flared. She looked like she wanted to lunge at him, but instead, she stomped over to her ATV and yanked at the handlebars, trying to pull it free from the trench. The tire spun uselessly in the dirt. Victor crossed his arms. Need a hand? Shut up, she snapped, her face red with frustration. She tried again, grunting as she put all her weight into it, but the ATV wasn't budging. She cursed under her breath before pulling out her phone. Victor watched as she angrily dialed a number. He figured she was calling one of her friends, or maybe even the police, ready to spin the situation in her favor. But to his surprise, when she turned around, she was smirking. "Oh, you're going to regret this," she said, her voice suddenly dripping with arrogance. "You think you can keep me out? Just watch." Then, without another word, she stormed off, leaving her ATV stuck in the dirt as she marched back toward her house. Victor sighed, shaking his head. He had a bad feeling about this. Karen wasn't the kind of person to back down quietly. If she wasn't going to get her way through brute force, she was going to try something else. And he was right. The next morning, Victor woke up to something unexpected. There was a letter taped to his mailbox. A thick, official-looking envelope with the Homeowner Association's logo printed on the front. Victor frowned. He wasn't part of the Homeowner Association. His land had been here long before the neighborhood on the other side of the road had ever existed, and he had never signed any agreement to be included in their ridiculous rules. But when he opened the letter, his blood boiled. "Dear Mr. Carter, it has come to our attention that you have recently made unauthorized modifications to the landscape surrounding your property. These modifications, including unapproved fencing and unregulated terrain alterations, directly violate the Homeowner Association's aesthetic guidelines for the neighborhood. As your property falls within the recently expanded jurisdiction of our Homeowner Association, you are hereby required to submit a request for approval before making any further changes to the exterior of your land. Failure to comply with these regulations may result in daily fines and potential legal action. We strongly encourage you to correct these violations immediately to avoid further penalties. Sincerely, Homeowner Association Compliance Office." Victor crumpled the letter in his fist. He knew Karen was behind this. She must have run straight to the Homeowner Association, whining about how he was ruining the neighborhood by blocking her off from his property. And now, somehow, they were trying to claim jurisdiction over his land. That was not going to happen. Victor wasn't about to let a bunch of bureaucratic busybodies tell him what he could or couldn't do on property that had belonged to his family for decades. If Karen wanted a war, she had just declared one, and Victor was more than ready to fight. Victor didn't waste time after reading the Homeowner Association letter. He had never been a part of their ridiculous organization, never signed any agreements, and as far as he was concerned, they had no legal grounds to tell him what he could or couldn't do with his own land. But the fact that they had the audacity to claim jurisdiction over his property told him one thing. Karen was pulling strings. He stormed back inside, slammed the letter onto his kitchen table, and immediately pulled out his phone. His first call was to the county records office. After a long hold, a grumpy-sounding clerk confirmed what Victor already knew. His property had never been, and was still not, part of any homeowner association. The clerk even laughed when Victor read the letter aloud. "Sounds like someone's trying to pull a fast one on you," the man on the other end chuckled. Victor wasn't laughing. His second call was to his lawyer. He explained the situation, and within minutes, the lawyer assured him that the homeowner association had no legal claim over his land. "They can send as many letters as they want," the lawyer said. "Doesn't mean a damn thing. They have no authority. But if they try to fine you, let me know." Victor hung up, feeling slightly better, but not by much. He knew Karen wasn't going to stop just because she got a useless piece of paper sent his way. No, she was going to escalate. And that's exactly what she did. The next day, just after noon, Victor was working on repairing a section of his fence when he heard sirens in the distance. At first, he didn't think much of it, until he saw the sheriff's cruiser turning down his driveway. Victor wiped the sweat from his forehead and walked over, his gut already telling him who was behind this. The sheriff, a man named Tom Grant, stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his belt as he surveyed the property. Victor didn't even give him a chance to speak. Let me guess, Victor said, crossing his arms. Karen called you. Sheriff Grant let out a long sigh. Yeah, he admitted. She claims you've been harassing her. Says you threatened her and tried to block her from accessing her property. Victor laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Her property? She's been trespassing on my land for weeks, tearing up my fields. And now she's got the nerve to call the cops on me. Grant held up a hand. Calm down, Victor. I know Karen. I also know how she is. He glanced toward the reinforced fence and the trenches. I figured there was more to the story. Victor huffed, still fuming. She's been cutting through my fields with her damn ATV, wrecking my crops, and ignoring every warning I've given her. I put up signs, I reinforced my fence, and now she's run crying to the homeowner association, pretending she's got authority over my land. Grant nodded slowly. Yeah, that letter was, he sighed. Already checked. He leaned against the hood of his cruiser, rubbing his temple. Look, I'm not here to arrest anyone, but Karen's not backing down. She filed an official complaint, and now I gotta do my job and look into it. Victor clenched his jaw. So what? I'm supposed to stop protecting my land just because she doesn't like it? Grant exhaled. No, but I need to ask. Did you actually threaten her? Victor narrowed his eyes. The only thing I threatened was her free ride through my property. Grant smirked at that. That's what I thought. He pulled out a notepad and scribbled something down. All right, here's the deal. You're in the clear for now, but Karen's probably not done. She wants to push this, and if she does, it might turn into a civil matter. Victor gritted his teeth. What do I do then? Grant glanced toward the house across the road, where Karen was no doubt watching this entire exchange from behind her perfectly polished windows. Keep your cameras rolling, Grant advised. If she steps foot on your land again, you'll have solid proof. She pulls another stunt, call me first, not the lawyer. Let's keep this from turning into a mess. All right. Victor nodded. Fine. Grant tipped his hat. Good. Now, I'm going to go over there and have a chat with her. Victor watched as the sheriff climbed back in his car and drove up the hill toward Karen's house. He didn't have to hear the conversation to know how it was going. He could already picture Karen fake crying, twisting the story to make herself look like the victim. But it didn't matter, because Victor had just been given permission to fight back. He walked back to his house, his mind already working on his next move. If Karen wanted a war, he was about to give her one. Victor wasn't the type to pick a fight, but when someone brought one to his doorstep, he damn well made sure he finished it. Karen had spent weeks trampling over his land, calling the cops on him, trying to get the homeowner association involved. And now, thanks to Sheriff Grant's visit, he had official confirmation that she had no legal ground to stand on. That meant one thing. Karen was running out of options. And people like her, they got desperate when they started losing control. He didn't have to wait long to see what she'd try next. The following morning, Victor was sitting in his kitchen, sipping his coffee, when he noticed movement outside. He stood up, peering through the window, and his stomach tightened. A tow truck was parked near the edge of his property, right by the trench where Karen had abandoned her ATV. Two men stood beside it, one talking to Karen while the other worked on hooking the ATV up to the winch. Victor exhaled through his nose. He had no problem with her getting her damn machine out of his land. He just didn't trust how she was going to do it. Grabbing his hat, he stepped outside and walked down toward them. As he got closer, Karen turned, that smug look already plastered on her face. Well, she drawled, adjusting her sunglasses. Decided to come say goodbye to my ride? Victor ignored her, looking at the man handling the winch. Victor said, make sure you don't mess up my property any more than she already has. The worker gave a short nod, clearly uninterested in their feud. Karen, on the other hand, lived for it. You know, she said, folding her arms, I could have sued you for damages. Victor let out a short laugh. Damages? You drove on my property and got stuck. That's on you. Karen's smirk twitched, but she didn't drop it. Oh, don't worry. I'll be sending you the bill. Victor took a slow step closer, lowering his voice. You go ahead and try, Karen. Send me all the bills you want. Hell, why stop there? Get the homeowner association to draft up another fake letter while you're at it. Karen's face darkened. Good. He was done playing nice. Face it, he continued. You lost. You can't trespass anymore. You can't get the homeowner association to bully me. The sheriff knows what you're up to. And if you so much as step onto my land again, I'll have you arrested for criminal trespassing. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she had nothing to say. The tow truck finished pulling the ATV free. The worker unhooked it, climbed back into the driver's seat, and drove off without a word. Karen stood there, her hands balled into fists, staring at her now dusty machine. Victor turned and started walking back toward his house. He had barely made it 5 steps when Karen snapped. You think this is over? She screeched. You think you won? Victor stopped, but he didn't turn around. Karen's breathing was ragged, furious. You can't just block me out. Victor finally looked over his shoulder. Karen, he said, his voice calm, steady. That's exactly what I did. Her face contorted in rage. She let out a furious scream, stomped toward her ATV, yanked on the handlebars. And in her anger, she pulled too hard. The machine tipped, and with a loud thud, it crashed onto its side. For a long, long moment, there was silence. Then Victor chuckled, shaking his head. Good luck with that, he muttered, walking back to his house. Karen didn't call the cops again. She didn't try to trespass. She didn't send any more fake letters. She had lost, and she knew it. Over the next few weeks, Victor noticed a change. Karen's ATV stayed parked in her garage, gathering dust. She stopped throwing smug glances his way whenever she drove past. She didn't even look at his property anymore. Then one day, a for sale sign went up in her yard. Victor smiled to himself as he watched the real estate agent hammer it into the ground. Karen was leaving. And Victor? He finally had his land back.